Michael Billig is Professor of Social Sciences in the Department of Social Sciences at Loughborough University. Mick, perhaps we could start if you tell me more about how you started in social psychology, where you were and who you were working with.
Well, I was an undergraduate at Bristol University. I was studying psychology and philosophy, joint degree. And to be quite frank, I wasn't very interested in the psychology. The philosophy seemed much more interesting until halfway through my third year, Henri Tajfel was appointed, and he gave a course of lectures in social psychology. And suddenly, here was a subject I could grasp. He was talking about social issues such as racism and prejudice, and suddenly it came alive. And I graduated, and I had no intention of going into psychology, but that summer, Henri asked me if I had any employment, and I said I didn't. And he employed myself and another recent graduate, Bob Bundy, to design and conduct an experiment for which he had an idea.
So you were the actual experimenters on what became later the famous Tajfelian minimal group paradigm experiments.
That's right. He said he had this idea that people might identify with a completely crazy group identity, but he didn't quite know how to put it into practice, and it was our job. And we did it that summer, and it was quite entertaining. I don't think at the time we knew quite why we were doing it, but it was a very nice experiment to run.
Henri Tajfel, with whom you were working, is perhaps one of the most influential psychologists ever to have worked in Britain. Tell me something about what it was like to work with him and in that environment, that school of psychology that he developed in Bristol.
Did you ever meet him?
No, I didn't.
Well, he was an extraordinary man. He had such a quick intellect and such wide-ranging knowledge, and also enthusiasm. He was an inspiring sort of person. And it wasn't just his obvious intellectual academic qualities. I think he also represented much more, because we all knew his background as a survivor of the Holocaust, and he made it quite clear that the reason he was doing social psychology was to understand why genocide might have happened. And so if he was doing experiments, there was a real reason behind them.
Now that reason informed a lot of the experiments, even though sometimes it's not visible in the actual experimentation. But did it form part of the way you talked about it with Henri and with the others in that group at that time?
Well, Henri talked about it in that way, although not directly. I mean, he didn't talk directly about his experiences, but he talked indirectly about them. But he conveyed a great sense that social psychology should have something to say about the major political and social events of the times. And if it didn't, it wasn't worth doing. He wasn't interested in experiments for their own sake.
If you'd had the chance, would you have stayed on in Bristol?
Well, I was in Bristol for my postgraduate. My PhD was in minimal groups and running experiments. I also had a year postdoc. I think it was time to move. I mean, there was a great attraction in staying on. There wasn't a post, and when there was, someone else was appointed. I think it was right to move.
Now, eventually you moved away from intergroup work, but before we leave that, perhaps you could tell me something about the work that went into your 1976 book, Intergroup Relations.
Well, originally that was intended to be a joint work with Henri, and he was going to be the senior author, and he employed me to write some of the early chapters dealing with background theory of intergroup relations. And that gave me the opportunity to read widely, read out of social psychology, read some sociology, anthropology, read Marx for the first time, which I found a revelation. And I really got caught up in the subject matter, and I kept writing and writing and writing. And at that time, Henri was very involved in setting up the European Association of Social Psychology. He was incredibly busy and influential in that. And he didn't write anything. And it got to a stage where I'd written an enormous amount, and he, with an act of generosity, which is very rare in academic life, because you must remember at that time he hadn't written a book himself. And he said, well, this is going to be your book, you finish it. And not only did he say that, but he ensured it was published in his own series, and he gave it every support. As I look back on that, I can just see how generous and how encouraging he was.
Not only was it a landmark book, it was a book under your own name, but it also was a combination of experiences which made you start to read widely, much more widely than experimental psychology. So the seeds were sown for your move away from experimental psychology, which started more in earnest when you got your next job, which is at Birmingham.
That's right. I then did some research into the extreme right, looking at the British fascist group, the National Front. And of course, if you're interested in what makes people join a group like the National Front, you can't ask members to take part in an experiment and measure their reaction times. You have to go and talk to them. And so the topic, more than anything, moved me away from doing experiments. And I must say, I kept in touch with Henri Tajfel, and he was very, very encouraging.
It must have been a support to you to have Henri's encouragement, because in Birmingham it was a, shall we say, more traditional psychology department. Now you had some support, but the work you were doing researching the National Front, you were doing more or less on your own.
In terms of the department, yes, absolutely on my own. But I was fortunate also in Birmingham to meet up with another person who became like a second teacher after Henri Tajfel, a man who wasn't an academic, who I think had limited formal education, but a very great man, Maurice Ludmer, who was the editor of an anti-fascist magazine called Searchlight. And when I started on the topic, I contacted him, and he was enormously helpful. He had a long background in the trade union movement, and he added something to the academic study, which I think a purely academics can't add.
Not only was the content different, the area different, the kinds of people you were talking to different, you were moving in a, should we say, rather murky world of conspiracy theorists and fascists. And your range of references changed also in the methods you were using. Now, did you have to invent your own methods for talking with these people and analysing what they said?
Yes, I think in a way, I wouldn't call it invented, it was just using common sense. I read some books about interviewing, and they really weren't any help. So I contacted people and had conversations, and yes, I suppose felt my own way through it.
It was very much feeding your own way through some dangerous territory. Not, I don't mean just physically dangerous, although that was also true, but also dangerous in disciplinary terms. This was on the boundaries of psychology, sociology, political science.
Well, that aspect didn't seem dangerous at all. I was interested in the topic, and I was looking at it and trying to look at it as directly as I could. And of course, the topic of fascism is a topic which some very profound and scholarly works have been written. So there were ample guides in the library to the topic.
And in finding those guides, it also opened up for you, if I'm not mistaken, a notion of not just scholarly work, which had always been with you, but scholarly work which was going to build or take advantage of the long tradition of Western philosophy, and work on areas which are, for social psychologists, rather unfamiliar, like rhetoric. There was even a trove of classical works in the Birmingham Library which you stumbled across, and you found very stimulating. Oh
yes, that came later. There was a little, after I'd done the work on fascism, there was a little gap, and I was interested in developing ideas about ideology, because really the work on fascism had suggested to me the importance of ideology. But there was, if you want, a subculture of ideology in the fascist groups, passing on the conspiracy theories from generation to generation of fascist, or cohort to cohort. And that got me thinking about ideology and reading more sociological works about ideology. But then, as you say, I started reading works which were maybe slightly bizarre for a psychologist. I got to a time, well, I didn't quite know what I was going to do, but I was very conscious of the fact that I'd never read Plato or Aristotle, and I thought, well, this job gives me time to read. It did in those days. I don't know what it does now for young academics. And I thought, well, if I was going to get run under a bus, the one thing which I'd regret having not taken advantage of all this was to read Plato and Aristotle, and I did. And from that I started getting interested in the ancient sophists and their approach to rhetoric. And again, this was like a revelation. It was so exciting. I was reading things about a topic I knew nothing.
Could you combine that with your day-to-day bread and butter work in a psychology department?
Well, yes, I did. Yes, I went in, gave a few lectures on first year on experimental psychology, and then went off to the library, read some stuff, and then did other things in the department. But I did feel there was a separation between my intellectual work, which I was doing, or academic work, and what you say, some of the day-to-day routines.
Were you still talking with social psychologists? Because even though it was a traditional psychology department, there were other social psychologists, and you were still presumably in contact with the social psychology community, which you'd been part of explicitly in the Tajfelian tradition in Bristol. Your lines of communication were always still open.
Well, first of all, within the department, I had a very good colleague, Ray Cochrane, who's done some superb work on the epidemiology of mental illness. And in fact, we worked together on a project on children's or young people's political attitudes. Always kept in contact with him. He didn't quite go the way I did, but he was a very, very good academic. And his interests actually were peripheral to mainstream psychology. At that time, I seemed to, especially after Henri's death, I drifted away from contact with other experimental social psychologists in Britain.
But your line of sight always included psychology. And you were working at this time in ideology, in rhetoric, and you were starting to accumulate thoughts which would later become your book, Arguing and Thinking.
Yes.
Now that has in its sights psychology. Psychology as it's traditionally thought of. Cognition, memory, language, the internal world. Now one of the things you revolutionarily turned was to say, well, it's not an internal, private world, or if it is, it's populated by the same kinds of things which are visible in the public domain. So it's psychology, but seen as part of a long tradition of rhetoric and argumentation. Was it around that time in Birmingham, or when you made the move to Loughborough, that kind of thinking became more part of your everyday work?
I'm not too certain. Well, certainly at Birmingham, in reading particularly Aristotle, realised that Aristotle was talking about psychology. His book, Rhetoric, was really about social psychology, about persuasion, about attitudes, and many of the questions which later experimental social psychologists addressed through experimentations, Aristotle discussed. And putting my hand on my heart, I couldn't say to students, Aristotle's stuff was a bit trivial, you've really got to read the latest issue of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. I can't help it. Aristotle, Rhetorical, was much more profound and full of insights and humour. That's part of it. So I felt that rhetoric was social psychological. And then there's a short step to say, well, and then social psychology is rhetorical, that the way people think is rhetorical, that you need language, and if you have an internal deliberation of wondering what to do, what you're doing is having some sort of internal argument, and you're thinking along the same lines as people who have public outward arguments think. When I came to Loughborough, I was delighted to find there were people here who were thinking along those same lines, like Derek Edwards and Dave Middleton, but had come from a different direction. And they added something which I knew nothing about, really, which is about the fine detail of microsociological analysis, particularly conversation analysis and ethnomethodology.
Now, you came to Loughborough specifically to a department of social sciences, where there was a wide range of people. Now, was that something which you felt was going to give you a wider scope, more voices, more points of reference outside psychology, or was it simply the matter of the next job to go to?
Oh, no, this was a definite attraction. I was always interested, since I'd done my postgraduate work, in reading outside of psychology and the social sciences, but I was very conscious of being an amateur, being self-taught, huge gaps. And coming here was like I keep coming to a toy shop. There were people who could put me right about things, and who then were interested in what social psychology might have to contribute to the social sciences. And in fact, in talking to colleagues here, I wasn't conscious of boundaries. It was a sense of discovery and discussion about matters which interested us.
And that pretty quickly yielded a publication, a very interesting book called Ideological Dilemmas,
Yes.
which you did jointly with 4 other people from the department. Tell us something about how that came to pass.
Well, we were meeting and talking about language and about ideology, and we decided one way to try and get some focus would be to write a book around the theme that ideology impinges on everyday life and everyday thinking, but not in the sense which it often was thought of imposing a definite matrix. But it provides themes actually which are contradictory and you have to work through and talk through. And amongst the collaborators were people like Derek Edwards, who had a lot of experience analysing the details of talk, and Mike Gain, who is a sociological theorist and who provided much of a historical and sociological background. It was a very interesting project to be involved in.
And Susan Condor, coming from a social psychological background, in fact, not dissimilar to yours.
Yeah, that's right, absolutely.
And Dave Middleton, coming from a cognitive background, but seeing it very much in more distributed cognition types of ways.
Right. And Alan Radley with his detailed knowledge about the psychology and sociology of health.
Indeed.
And we were all, I think, united by a sense that disciplinary boundaries didn't matter.
Yes.
And what was interesting was always just what was beyond your own disciplinary boundary.
Is it fair to say that Ideological Dilemmas was one more step along from fascists, where the notion was that here we have a bunch of people who are considered by society as extreme. In fact, part of their own discourse is to consider themselves as being at the margin, as being knowing things that other people don't. Fascists, conspiracy theorists. Through your work on people who aren't fascists and who aren't conspiracy theorists, but have got political orientations like the Young Conservatives who you worked with, so a lovely chapter in that book, through to people talking about anybody, talking about the royal family, again, about an ostensibly and a clearly political, strong opinion type of subject, through to you and I, anybody at any time, necessarily having to maneuver around, work with dilemmas of everyday life, where the central issue always is how this person as a social being and as a, quotes, cognitive mental being is inevitably involved in a dialectic of some kind, some opposition, some dilemma, some choice. And he or she has to manage it, not privately, but also publicly in the interactional sphere.
Yes, oh, absolutely. I mean, I was conscious, having written the work on fascism, that it would be very easy to make the equation that studying fascism was studying racism, and that racism was just a matter of some extreme and unpleasant people, and that if you can stop a group like the National Front, you've solved racism. And that politically is just not acceptable, because racism in British society, American society, European society stretches beyond the extremes. It's more endemically rooted in the society. And indeed, this was the basis of much of Henri Tajfel's work, but prejudice didn't belong to people who just had authoritarian personalities. Prejudice was related to the ordinary, mundane, banal ways of thinking, but it was part of categorization. So I was very conscious that I should move on and look at the way that ideology, including ideological prejudices, impinge on everyday life. And this was part of the thinking behind my work on nationalism. Nationalism isn't something which just crops up in rather vigorous nationalist movements and visible movements of people who are trying to rebel against existing boundaries, but nationalism is part of ordinary life in established nation-states in the contemporary world.
Now, the clearest statement of that, although it appears in many parts of your writing, is in the book Banal Nationalism. Yes. Now, that was written at Loughborough, and it's got a very wide palette, and it's known to a much broader variety of academic than social psychologists. Tell us something about how that came to pass.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not very good at working out why I start things. I suddenly find myself doing something and then I can't stop doing it. And then afterwards I give a story to say how it almost had been planned in advance, which it probably didn't. But I do think there are patterns, and that certainly does fit the pattern of looking at the unnoticed, the routine aspects of human conduct. I think arguing thinking was trying to address the question of what you know you're thinking about. And there's a gap, but not all mental life is what you're consciously aware of. They're things you do routinely, and I think some of the micro-sociological work of the ethno-methodology for conversation analysis is very, very good at pointing out the complexity of talk, which even the speakers, if you ask them afterwards, did you do that or say that, they say, no, I can't remember, it's just something which happens, like you nodding there or me putting my hand out and so on. But it's not just interpersonal. In this forgotten or unnoticed aspects of life, there's also ideological elements. The analogy I use in banal nationalism are the flags which you don't notice, which you don't salute, but which flutter outside cinemas or post offices and garage forecourts and so on, particularly in the United States.
Yes. Where their meaning, their force, their power is to be read by an informed commentator.
No, the meaning, I think, is really not to be noticed, so that you have these little symbols turning a place into a nation or a national home, which you feel at home in, like in your own home. You don't notice everything, but it becomes homely.
But there's a paradox there, isn't it, methodologically, I think, which is that I understand and I'm comfortable with that claim, that these unnoticed small tags, labels, symbols, uses of the word we, our team, the weather, those things that you show us happen in the most liberal of magazines, in the middle of newspapers, which treat us as being all part of the same place, do these things. But what I'm asking, I guess, is how does the analyst know that they're being done?
Right. Well, for some, like the presence of a flag, it is there. Let us imagine, in the United States, let us imagine where there are uncounted numbers of flags. I don't think anyone's counted how many flags the average person sees per day. But if you just walk around the streets of the United States, you realise how many there are. Imagine one day you wake up, and instead of them being red, white and blue, someone has painted them orange, green and purple. Then people will say, what have you done to our flags? And I don't think you even need to do the experiment to know that it would be noticed, which implies that the unnoticed has not been totally unnoticed.
Well, I'm tempted to make that lead on directly to your interest in Freud and psychodynamics. I think that is a nice link. Now, this is something which is comparatively recent, I think.
Yeah.
It's fair to say you've always liked Freud as a writer. From a literary point of view, he's one of the kinds of psychologists you encourage your students to read for the pure beauty of his writing.
Yes.
And it's true that he's the kind of writer who's inspiring, who makes you think, what an elegant way of expressing something. But recently you've turned more analytically to his writing. And you want to, I think it's not unfair to say, put him in this, not the same bracket, because that's the wrong way of thinking of it as being something with ends to it, but rather approach him in the same dialectic spirit, in the same discursive, rhetorical spirit, and make of him not the Freud that traditional clinical psychology perhaps knows, but actually a rather more social Freud. Is that fair to say?
Yes, but it's a two-way process. As you say, there may be a pushing of Freud into a box which he wouldn't have been particularly happy to have been pushed in, but also a sense that he has something to offer which is unique, and that he tells us something also about the study of language. What I've been doing is looking again at Freud's concept of repression. And the pushing of Freud is to say, well, if we do repress things, we need certain linguistic skills to repress. It's not an unseen, mysterious process. It's if our thinking has as human beings, we have a huge verbal element, well, repression will be part of this. We know how to change the topic in conversation, so we can change the topic of our thoughts. But that's only half of it. The other thing is, if repression is so important, when it's important for social activity, we have to learn to resist temptation, but resist it routinely. And part of a resistance is we even drive the thought of temptation away. Now, I believe that this is involved in learning a language. That language both provides us with the means for repression, but demands repression for its accomplishment.
Now, we're going to get into deep waters here, but I'm tempted just to push you in a bit further and see how far we go. Now, the word repression sounds to many psychologists and people who use the word in other ways as being an explanation and not simply a description. Now, do you want to maintain that force to it?
No, I think it's a description. It becomes an explanation when it's implied that there is some sort of hydraulic mechanism behind the surface of what we say and what we do. I think the concept is useful for pointing out that human beings are mysterious. We do odd things. We don't just follow rules. Right. And there is a hinterland, an unexplored hinterland in all of us. And it's a hinterland we often try not to explore. And repression draws attention to this and describes it, I think, without saying, there's this force which unlocks it all. Because actually Freud, surprisingly, had very little to say about the processes of repression. And I think he was what he had to say was a bit silly.
When you say the processes, do you mean the reason for repression? Why somebody does repress such a thing?
No, he's very good at saying that. But what he's very bad at saying is how they actually go about repression. But sometimes he says, a patient, well, she must have, and it often is a she had this idea that she loved her brother-in-law, and this thought cropped up to her, and it was appalling to her, so she repressed it. But what did she do to repress it?
Now, but I don't want us to dwell, I don't want us to leave Freud on that note, because that might sound to somebody that you're talking about a way of reinterpreting Freud's relationship with his clients, but you're not. I think you're talking about our relationship with Freud. That's to say, what we could see in Freud's own rhetoric about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think that Freud's case histories are so rich in their detail that they're worth re-examining, and this is what I've been trying to do. It becomes an excuse for rereading Freud, which is a wonderful experience. But we can't find out more about his patients, what they really thought. That isn't the aim. In some ways, you can use those case histories to find out more about Freud. And Freud was thinking, and indeed what Freud was repressing from his theory. But he leaves traces in the case histories of the things he doesn't really want to talk about.
Now, partly that's an antiquarian delight in knowing more about Freud, but it's also something else. It's knowing about how a major intellectual figure is himself subject to the kinds of processes which he talks about in others.
That's right. And, of course, he's a product of his times, and he himself, in his place and time, was living at a central moment of European history, a moment which pays examining and re-examining and trying to understand. And Freud, as a Viennese Jew, looking at the irrationalities of human behaviour, had much to teach.
This might be a good point to use one of the most vivid examples, and that's the case of Dora, where Dora, well, you tell the story.
Oh,
the dream.
The dream, yes. This is a dream where Dora dreams of her wandering to a railway station and meeting a stranger and so on. And Freud's interpretation is all on the sexual element. And he and Dora almost conspire to avoid talking about their situation as Jews in Vienna at the time. This is the turn of the century, it's long before Nazism, but when Vienna was ruled by an anti-Semitic demagogue. And even Dora talks about going to an art gallery and standing for 2 hours looking at a picture of a Madonna, and Freud says she's identifying, but not then drawing a conclusion, which must have been at the back of both their minds, the guilt of identifying with the mother of Jesus, the mother of a religion of those who were explicitly oppressing them. And so there are repressed themes there. And what's also interesting, if that was a primary or secondary repression, a tertiary repression of later analysts who just ignored this. And today, there's many feminist analyses of Freud's case histories who are just interested in Dora as the heroine, even the Madonna figure as the woman heroine, just totally ignoring the obvious politics of the situation. And I can't do without a concept of repression to understand that.
Well, somebody who'd come across you now, hearing that analysis of Freud and an interest in repression, might say to themselves, hang on, is this the same Billig? Surely it must be somebody else. Because really I think you're at least 4, and now with Freud, 5 Billigs. You're Billig 1973, the classic, the locus of one of the classic minimal group paradigm experiments, which is known to thousands, now perhaps tens, hundreds of thousands, of undergraduates who learn about SIT and Tajfelian theory on the basis of the experiments of which you are one of the actual experimenters. Billig, 1973, classic reference. For political scientists, you're the uncoverer of the mental practices, habits of conspiracy theorists and fascists. For sociologists, you're the social scientist of ideology, the one who puts ideology into its everyday setting. And for a very, very broad range of social psychologists and people with an interest in language and how it's used, you're the author of Arguing and Thinking, which sees a rhetorical, dialectic point of language to clothe everyday reality and as a locus for everyday behavior. And with Freud, you're at least 5 people. Now, one thing I would get out of that set of dramatis personae, one current thing is your unwillingness to be limited by any one methodology. In fact, you've gone on record as being an anti-methodologist.
That's in your book, yes.
Indeed.
Yes.
Tell us more about that.
About your book, yes.
No,
it's an
no.
excellent book.
Yes, I know that. My mother thinks so too.
Good. I suppose it's a sort of low threshold of boredom. I mean, some academics develop an expertise fairly early in their career and then take it further and go deeper and deeper and deeper and become internationally known as the expert on X. I've never wanted, I have a do something and then want to get rid of it and read something different. And for me, the great delight in being in academic life is that you can continue to learn and that you can read things you've never read before. So my motivation for looking at Freud is I wanted to read Freud. For doing nationalism was I wanted to read works about nationalism. There's some outstanding works, Gellner and Benedict Anderson and so on. For me, I think everything would go flat if I stopped reading stuff which I'm just amazed at the quality and think, oh dear, I could never write anything like this. And that's the excitement of it.
But the other side of the coin of the pleasure of reading, the pleasure of not being limited to one genre or domain, the other side of the coin is also being able and willing and happy with all kinds of evidence, all kinds of ways of collecting ways of warranting your claims. And that's a consistent part throughout your work, that you will pick up evidence and use it on its own merits, be it experimental, be it discursive, be it rhetorical, be it political, with the signal issue always being, does it make scholarly sense? Can I make an argument out of this?
Yes. I mean, partly it's necessity, because I haven't always done the rigorous studies which I need to, so I have to be like a magpie and pick it up where I can. But also partly, I feel a method is a means, it's not an end in itself. I think I learned this from Henri Tajfel early on. He did experiments to answer or to get glimpses of answers for the problem which obsessed him. He didn't have a problem because he wanted to do experiments.
Now let's think of a way of coming to an end. Now your own career has seen some quite profound changes and shifts, and you've been part of a range of profound shifts in your own discipline, in social psychology. Now, suppose I had brought out my crystal ball and made you now suddenly become not a retrospector, but a seer into the future. Let's pretend that you were looking back now from 20 years on, say. What would you expect to have seen?
If I can take one step back from the question and imagine what I was looking, if I observed this when I was in my mid-20s and saw someone who was recording an official interview with the British Psychological Society saying where they think social psychology would be, I would say, well, I hope it's it will be wherever you say it won't be. But really, it's the nature of our game that each generation should see the world as it sees it, and then the next generation should have a new perspective and should be arguing against the establishment. The very fact we're sitting here having this conversation under these auspices, it gives it a certain, how shall I say, establishment flavour. And if social psychology is to develop, as I hope all academic disciplines develop, it must be through young people getting in sensing. It's not like those old codgers say it is.
Good. Michael Billig, thank you very much.
Thank you.